Well, the focus is now on the G20 summit in South Korea, and of most importance is the relationship between the U.S. and China. Joining us this morning is Lardy, the senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and also a widely followed expert on China. Nick, great to have you back on the program. Just before this break, we were talking with Sarah about her interview with Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs, who thinks that the U.S. and China actually agree more than they disagree, that there's a grand bargain going on right now. What do you make of that?
Well, I think potentially there's a grand bargain. I think we've yet to see all the elements in it. It certainly would involve more rapid appreciation of the currency, a more certain fiscal consolidation in the United States over the medium term, and a few other elements. But as I say, I don't think we see all the elements of that yet. Maybe they will emerge, but I think it's far from certain.
So what do you think is happening right now then, Nick?
Well, I think the real question at the moment is whether or not China will agree to support the quantitative or the indicative guidelines proposal that came out of the finance minister's central bank meeting 2 weeks ago in Korea, or whether the Chinese are going to resist any effort to kind of quantify or place limits on external positions.
Right, and they haven't been very clear on it, have they, since QE2 was implemented?
Well, they've criticized QE2, and of course they're not alone in that, but they haven't really definitively said whether or not they would support the indicative guidelines approach on external imbalances. They could criticize the U.S. for QE2 and still be willing to go along with...
But as I recall, there were some comments, yes, that they did criticize QE2, but at least one official, I believe, came out and said, look, I understand that the U.S. has to spur their own growth, that that's going to be a benefit for the world eventually.
That was Zhou Xiaochuan, the central bank governor, and he made some very sensible remarks and indicated that there were some advantages to China and the rest of the global economy if the United States recovery is more secure going forward. So he had a quite balanced approach compared to what we've heard, for example, coming out of Germany.
Okay. Then, Nick, what do you make about all this stuff about a currency war between the U.S. and China?
Well, I certainly hope it can be avoided. I don't think we're there yet. The Chinese external surplus is rising again. The U.S. deficit is rising quite substantially over the course of this year and looks set to continue to rise. So we are heading back into the imbalances that contributed to the global financial crisis in the first place. And I think it would be a big breakthrough if there could be a stronger commitment internationally within the G20 to limit the further expansion of these external imbalances.
Of these current account surpluses, essentially.
Yeah, surpluses on the Chinese side, the German side, the Swiss side, the deficit on primarily on the U.S. side. Okay,
so what is going to be, to you, a signal that we're heading in the right direction at the G20?
I think the strongest signal, and I don't think it's likely, but the strongest signal would be an explicit agreement for a quantitative target, a specific number on to really implement this indicative guidelines approach. In other words, instead of leaving it kind of fuzzy and unclear, to put a specific number on it on what would be desirable.
But
I mean,
Nick,
keep in mind, there are no...
No, go ahead.
There are no penalties for exceeding the number. You're subject to surveillance from the IMF, but there are no penalties if you were unable to meet the goal. So,
right, but why even talk about it? But Nick, why even talk about it though when you've already had Germany come out and say they would reject this, and you had Japan come out and say that they would reject this? It's very unlikely.
Well, again, I think it's a matter of international pressure. If there's a strong consensus in favor of this, then the Germans and the Japanese and others who don't want to go along will be standing on the sidelines and will be subject to opprobrium from the global community. And I think it puts moral pressure on them if the G20 were willing to take a stand on this.
Okay. All right, Nick, we're going to leave it there, but I appreciate you stopping by and talking with us about this. That was Lardy of the Peterson Institute discussing the G20 meeting and particularly U.S. and China.